So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. This afternoon, I'm really excited to introduce you to Franck Ramus, who is a CNRS Senior Research Scientist at the Department of Cognitive Studies in the Ecole Normale Supérieure in Paris, where he leads the Cognitive Development and Pathology team. His research investigates individual differences in cognitive development and in social achievement, their cognitive and neural basis, and the underlying genetic and environmental factors. His talk today is entitled Gender Differences in Maths in the First Grade, What are the Causes and How to Reduce Them? So thank you so much, Franck, for taking the time to speak to us today about this really interesting topic. And without further ado, over to you.
Thanks, Hannah, for the lovely invitation. So let me share my slides. Okay, can you see it now? Okay, so nice to see you all. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that what I will be talking about today is all the work of Lila Gurgan, who defended her PhD last year. And basically, this is all her PhD work. But she couldn't be here today to give her own talk. So I'll be giving my own version of her work. So it's about gender differences in mathematics, which we recently discovered appeared as early as first grade. First, what are the basic facts that we want to explain? So if you look on the left, this is the participation of girls in STEM tracks in French education in 10th grade, 11th, 12th grade, and in the first year of higher education. And as you can see, girls' participation decreases over the years, over grades. And on the right, this is again girls' participation in STEM tracks in higher education over the years, over the last 20 years. And although there's been a lot of progress since the time when I was a student, where there were many fewer women in science, over the last 20 years, basically, it has kind of stagnated between 25 and 30%. So, of course, this is viewed as a problem, and everybody would like to increase women's participation in science. Of course, one question that, there are plenty of questions that arises, and there can be multiple factors underlying these disparities. One question that arises is whether this is partly due to a difference in performance in mathematics and scientific disciplines. And indeed, there is evidence that in school in general, girls tend to perform slightly less well than boys in mathematics specifically, not in science in general, but in mathematics. Here on the left, you have data from the French national evaluations, which are given in first grade, second, third, fourth, at every grade now. This is sixth grade, eighth grade, 10th grade. And on the y-axis, you have the gender gap. So any bar above 0 would show an advantage in mathematics for girls. But as you can see, most bars are below 0, and so they show an advantage in mathematics for boys. And interestingly, when they are tested at the beginning of first grade, there is no difference. If anything, there is a small difference in favor of girls. But as soon as they go through first grade, these are tests that are given in February. So in the middle of first grade, there's a small gap that emerges in favor of boys, and this gap widens by the beginning of second grade. And also there are some tests, so this is not national evaluations, but tests that were given in preschool when the kids were 4 years old. And on some like pre-maths tests that they were given at that age was basically counting. The girls tended to do better than the boys. So it's interesting because this gender gap in favor of boys, it's kind of pervasive throughout the school years, but it begins very early, and yet it's not there at the beginning of primary school. So there's something going on that we need to understand, and everybody's wondering, why does it emerge at this time, like after 4 months of schooling in first grade? What are those teachers doing with those pupils such that this gap emerges? And of course, it may not be all the fault of teachers, but there is something going on that is slightly mysterious in first grade. Um, just a note to say that this is very particular to mathematics, that you don't see this in other disciplines. This graph shows you the school tests at the end of fifth grade and at the end of ninth grade. And in most other disciplines, girls tend to perform better than boys. Obviously, in all language-based disciplines, but also in sciences, there's just no difference. And as you know, overall, girls tend to perform better in school at all levels than boys. But there's this specific boy advantage in mathematics that requires an explanation. Um, this is similar data from the ELF cohort, which is our main database for this project. I'm going to explain in a minute what the ELF cohort is, but this is just to show that we have the same results in our database as is shown by the Education Ministry. So on the first line, well, let's look at the bottom line first. These are mathematics scores in first grade, in fourth grade, and on the left, this is preschool. And so you can see that in preschool, there's little difference. If anything, the girls score a little better. The girls are in dark blue and the boys in light blue. But in first grade, already the girls are lagging a bit behind, and again in fourth grade. So we see exactly the same thing as I showed in the previous slide. And in language and literacy skills in French, there is a girl's advantage throughout. And indeed, as we're going to see, the girl's advantage in language-based skills is there as early as you can measure it, basically from 18 months of age or 2 years of age. Okay, so, and yes, one last background slide to show that we're not special in France in that respect. This is observed in most countries in the world. So this is data from PISA. So this is measured much later when the kids are about 15. You all know about PISA, I'm sure. And so again, this shows the gender gap. So the bars above 0 mean that there's a boy advantage. And you can see that in most OECD countries, boys score higher than girls in mathematics, with a few exceptions where there's no difference or perhaps an opposite difference, but they're really outliers in this picture. And so France is really like has a gender gap whose mean is around which is around the mean of the OECD. By the way, the UK is around here and has a much wider gap than most OECD countries. I have no explanation about this. I'm just pointing this out. Okay, so how to understand this? So if we start, so this is a kind of causal model just to graphically represent hypotheses about underlying factors. So we're looking here, we're trying to explain differences in school performance and in vocational choices. And of course, there can be many different underlying factors. There can be, of course, differences in cognitive abilities, as we've seen, but also differences in preferences or motivation. There can be contextual factors, such as the famous stereotype threat. There can be differences in perceptions. And of course, if we go back to the more ultimate or distal factors, well, as usual, there are two categories of factors: early biological factors, such as genetic factors, and social factors. So for me, the point of this picture is just to make sure that we consider every possible causal factor, and I think that is important, although in this particular talk, we will focus exclusively on the social factors. And of course, everybody has ideas about what those social factors may be, and we all know that there is a process called gender socialization through which boys and girls learn what it means to be a boy and a girl and how to behave like a boy and a girl and so on. There are stereotypes about how boys and girls should be, and there are influences and role models and so on. So this is all very well known. And it's very well established that indeed boys and girls grow up in slightly different environments, under slightly different influences, and with slightly different models. And so these are obvious factors that could potentially explain differences in school performance in certain topics. For example, if boys and girls are given different activities that train different cognitive skills. Okay, now in many cases, many people are just satisfied with the well-established observation that boys and girls are exposed to different environmental factors, and they say, et voilà, that's the explanation for observed differences in cognitive skills or in school performance, in math performance. But I think you cannot stop there, right? I mean, it's a different thing to say there are differences in the environment and to say these differences in the environment play a causal role in the development of those differences in school achievement, in math achievement. I mean, the evidence for a causal role of this factor on that observation is much more difficult to obtain, but it is necessary, right? We cannot just leave it at that. So that was the point of this project, to try and test the hypothesis that indeed those differences in boys and girls environments have a causal effect on the differences that are observed later. So we have a series of studies about it. The first study is about gender socialization that occurs within the family. So this is like the reduced causal model. And so in that study, we had the opportunity to measure two aspects of gender socialization. One is the activities that children do in the home, because basically we're relying on questionnaires that were filled by parents. And so this is a very plausible hypothesis, for example, that if boys are given more toys with balls or construction sets or all sorts of toys that may require spatial skills, then they may be given more opportunities to develop those spatial skills than girls, and maybe those spatial skills play a role in later math ability. So, yeah, it may be that boys and girls are trained in different ways thanks to the toys and activities that they are provided. And then there's this second construct that we were able to question using the questionnaires, which is what we called family gender organization, or basically the way mothers and fathers share the tasks within the household. Okay, let's look at those two in more detail. So first, the ELF cohort is the largest French birth cohort, which recruited 18,000 children that were born in 2011. And they were followed up for many years until now. We're currently preparing the 16-year-old, the 16-year-old campaign. And so at many different stages, parents were given questionnaires to fill in, and at some stages, the kids were tested. And at some crucial stages, like when they were 5.5 years old in preschool, and also when they were in first grade, when they were 7, the teachers were sent questionnaires and tests to be given to the child. And in this way, we also obtained some measures of performance in French and mathematics that I showed in a previous slide. So the idea is to use those school tests in preschool and in first grade as outcomes, and to try and predict those outcomes using information from the family environment that were gathered through the questionnaires in the early years. More specifically, we we looked in all those questionnaires that were filled by the parents for questions that concerned children's activities. And you have a sample of those questions here. There were 44 of them. And because we wanted to select activities that had the potential to explain later sex differences, we specifically selected those questions which showed a sex difference to begin with a cohorts d greater than 0.1. So this was the case of all those that are shown here. And then we used a factor analysis to aggregate the answers to all those questions in one single variable, which we called the gendered activity factor. And aligning the polarity of the sex differences across all those questions in order to make an index such that when you have a positive value, this means that the child does more masculine activities, and when they have negative values, they do more feminine activities. This is entirely data-based in the sense that we did not decide in the first place what was more masculine or feminine. We just observed which activities were done more often by boys and more often by girls. And so when you aggregate all these questions into a single variable and you look at the distribution, this is what you get. So you get a very clear bimodal distribution whereby girls tend to have more feminine activities here on the left, and boys tend to have more masculine activities here on the right. This is obtained by construction of this index, and because we have selected the questions that showed a sex difference to begin with, because that was the purpose of this study. So we have our gendered activities index. We also constructed a gendered family organization index by following more or less the same method. So we had another set of 43 questions about who did the tasks in the household, the mother or the father, and this was therefore restricted to families with one mother and one father. And as you can imagine, in most families, the answer to all those questions is that the mother does most of all of this, except for repairs. But nevertheless, who does what differs between families. And so again, we aggregated them into a single index, such that in that index, when you had a negative value, this meant that the family had a very stereotypical organization where basically the mother does everything except the repairs. And when you had a positive score, the family would show either a more balanced organization or even a counter stereotypical organization where the father would do most of those tasks. And when you look at the distribution, this time it's not bimodal because there's not much reason why these distribution of tasks between mothers and fathers would differ depending on the sex of the child involved in the ELF cohort. Okay, so we have our two indices. And so, yes, our hypothesis is that both the gender activities and the gendered family organization might have an influence on later math scores and the gender difference in math scores. So what did we find? First, if you look at the effect of the gender activities index on first grade math scores, it's quite interesting to see that there's just no relationship. Actually, if you look across boys and girls, there is a very small correlation, but it's just due to the fact that boys and girls differ both in their gendered activities and in their math scores. But if you adjust on sex and you look, therefore, within each sex, within boys and within girls, there's just no relationship between gendered activities and math performance, which I think was the greatest surprise for me in this entire project. This is the one analysis on which I had bet that we might find an effect of training in certain activities, developing certain skills. Well, we find no evidence whatsoever for this hypothesis. On the other hand, the gendered family organization seemed to have an effect. So if you look first at this graph, so the gendered family organization index is here on the x-axis and math scores are on the y-axis. Girls are in dark blue and boys are in light blue. And so what you can see is that this gendered family organization index has an effect on girls' performance only in maths and in first grade. So girls have higher math scores in families that have the most counter-stereotypical gendered family organization. And they have the worst math performance in those who have the most stereotypical organization. Whereas it seems to make no difference for boys' math performance. Therefore, the gender gap in math is greatest in those families with the stereotypical gendered family organization. And also, interestingly, this is observed only for math, not for literacy, and only in first grade where the gender gap is observed, and not in preschool when it is not observed. So there seems to be something to do with this gendered family organization. And of course, it does not explain all the gender gap in maths, but it explains about 7% of this gap. So to conclude this part, we have this gendered family organization that seems to explain a small share of the gender differences in math in first grade, whereas gendered activities do not. And of course, our measures are not perfect. Remember that we were not there in the families to measure everything. We just ask a limited number of questions to the parents at several ages. And so we do not cover all the possible activities of the child. We do not cover all the possible aspects in which the families might differ in terms of gendered organization. So of course, we're in a situation where we must be underestimating those effects. But still, it's interesting that we find an effect of one and not of the other. Also, note that this gendered family organization, we do not imagine that it has a direct effect on math performance. There is no plausible mechanism there. Rather, we see this as a proxy. Like a family with a very stereotypical gendered organization of tasks between mother and father is a certain type of family that must also have other stereotypical aspects, such as some things that the parents do with the child, some things that the parents say to the child must differ from the other type of family at the other end of this GFO spectrum. And these are the more proximal factors that may have an effect on math performance, but not this more abstract gender family organization. Okay, so these are our results for gender socialization. Now let's move on to another question, which is the effect of behavior on school performance, because as you may have noticed, boys and girls do not behave exactly in the same way, both in school and out of school. And so these differences in behaviors, there are several ways to capture this. Here, because of the questionnaires that were given in the ELF cohort, the way we captured them was through the notion of externalizing and internalizing symptoms. So, internalizing symptoms are behavioral symptoms that are not expressed overtly, but can be similar like to depressive symptom or anxiety, withdrawal. Whereas externalizing symptoms are overtly behaviorally expressed, and they can manifest in the form of hyperactivity or conduct disorder and so on in the pathological range, but it's of course a continuum. So there was a questionnaire addressing internalizing and externalizing symptoms, and therefore we had the following hypothesis. We hypothesized that girls tend to have more internalizing symptoms than boys, and that this might partly explain their poorer performance in maths, because this might relate to so-called math anxiety. Furthermore, we also predicted that the higher externalizing symptoms in boys might partly explain their poor performance in literacy and perhaps in other domains, because basically, as you know, boys' behavior is less consistent with what is required in a classroom than girls' behavior. And indeed, so in the ELF cohort, we had this strength and difficulties questionnaire, which was administered at several time points, both to parents and to teachers. This is a 20-question scale that subdivides into 4 subscales. You can read the questions here, and they're rated from 0 to 2 points each item. And so here, because the scale was not fully was not administered in full to the teachers, we rather than considering each of these 4 subscales separately, we aggregated them into an internalizing subscale, gathering both the emotional problems and the and the peer problem scale, and an externalizing score, which aggregated hyperactivity and conduct problem scale. This is also another standard way of analyzing the SDQ questions. And also note that we're analyzing the SDQ questions that were administered before first grade, and we're going to analyze the extent to which they predict math performance in first grade. So there's this longitudinal component which addresses the possibility of reverse causation. First, we look at the distribution of boys and girls scores in internalizing and externalizing. First surprise for us is that there was no sex difference in internalizing scores. Then we went back to the literature and we found that this was consistent with the rest of the literature. It is known that girls tend to have more internalizing symptoms than boys, but this tends to appear later in adolescence, not as early as this particular study. However, we do find pretty consistent sex differences in externalizing, with the boys having more externalizing symptoms as expected. Okay, if we have a brief look at the correlation table, these are the internalizing and the externalizing scores on the right-hand side, and these are all the school measures and the MacArthur-based communicative development inventory here, some social variables, etc. And yes, basically this shows you that those internalizing and externalizing symptoms are negatively correlated with all those school outcomes as well as with those social measures. Yeah, maybe I did not say it clearly enough, but these scores are like symptom scores. So the higher and the more severe the symptoms. Okay, so this is pretty normal. And now we conducted mediation analysis. Basically, the question was, we have this sex effect on math scores in first grade. And the question is, to which extent are they mediated by these behavioral differences in externalizing and in internalizing? And the answer is, well, this sex effect is partly mediated by the externalizing score and not mediated by the internalizing score, which makes sense because this is because there's no sex difference in internalizing score. Therefore, there was no scope for it to mediate anything. But given the sex difference in externalizing score, there is a mediation, but this mediation has the opposite sign from the total effect. And indeed, boys have more externalizing symptoms which are disruptive, which disrupt school performance. Therefore, those externalizing symptoms also disrupt their math performance. So they actually decrease the gender gap in math compared to if they had the same behavior as girls. So it's a mediation, but it's a mediation in the opposite direction. On the other hand, if you look at the same mediation model for literacy, again, internalizing does not explain anything. And here, externalizing also partly mediates the sex effect on literacy, but this time it has the right sign. It's a positive sign, which means that the boys' higher externalizing symptoms partly explain the fact that they have lower scores in literacy. And if you look at the percentage mediations, it mediates about 40% of the total sex effect on literacy. So to summarize, internalizing shows no gender difference at that age. Greater externalizing symptoms in boys drags their performance down, both in maths and in literacy. So it means that this increases the gender gap in literacy, those externalizing symptoms, and they also increase the gender gap, they decrease the gender gap in maths. So to phrase it the other way around, if boys and girls behaved the same, if they had exactly the same level of externalizing behavior, then the gender gap in literacy would be smaller, but the gender gap in maths would be larger, which is not exactly what we had predicted, but that's what we found. Now move on to the next study where we wondered whether teachers might have a contribution as well to this gender gap in math. And so, yeah, this is the reduced model to teachers' influences. And indeed, there is already evidence that teachers might have an effect. This is a study on grades 3 and 4 in Turkey, where teachers' explicit gender stereotypes had been questioned, and it has been shown that girls' math scores on the y-axis decrease as their teachers' gender stereotypes increase. It's a small effect, but it's there. So that's the first hint. The second hint is this study on teachers' implicit gender stereotypes as measured by the gender science implicit association test. And this time this was in 8th grade in Italy. And again, this study shows that as teachers have higher implicit gender biases, the math scores of girls decrease, and whereas this has no effect on boys. So these are indications that indeed teachers may matter, may contribute to this gender socialization, expectations, stereotypes, etc., that have an effect on math performance. Unfortunately, in the ELF cohort, the teacher questionnaires were relatively short, and the investigators did not dare asking such offensive questions as about their gender stereotypes and the likes. So we have no measure whatsoever of these constructs. The only things that we have about those teachers is their gender, their age, number of years of experience, number of years of education, and their disciplinary background. So these are very remote distal factors, but still, we hypothesize that perhaps that these factors have an effect on gender stereotypes or differential behavior that might have an effect in the classroom. And so we hypothesize that the gender gap in math might be reduced for teachers that have a scientific background, that have a higher degree, that are more experienced, and perhaps that are younger. And we should see this as interactions between child sex and the teacher, those teacher characteristics. And we further hypothesize that the math gender gap might be reduced in the case when teachers are women with a scientific background, because they might provide a more positive role model for science and mathematics. And this would be manifested in a triple interaction. And the analysis was done on 3,800 first grade teacher-student dyads. And the results are that in our search for these simple interactions, there was nothing significant to talk about. No teacher characteristic directly interacted with pupil sex. However, we did observe the triple interaction. although not quite in the direction that we expected. As you can see, the main effect occurs here between male teachers who have a science background and male teachers who don't have a science background. Basically, male teachers who have a science background are those who have the largest gender gap in mathematics in their classes. Yeah, I forgot to say this is math scores on the y-axis, girls' performance in light blue, boys' performance in dark blue, and therefore the whole length of the two bars gives you the size of the gender gap. So we see the gender gap across the four categories of teachers, but it's largest for the male teachers with a science background. It's smallest for the male teachers without a science background. And the pattern seems to be the opposite within the female teachers, which was to some extent somewhat predicted. I mean, you could have predicted that the female teachers without a science background might be some kind of negative role model, because we know that those teachers on average also tend to have math anxiety, are not very confident at teaching math, and they might provide a negative role model for girls with respect to math. But in fact, this difference here is not statistically significant. By the way, notice the difference in sample size between the four categories of teachers. Of course, these are first grade teachers, and most of them are females. And in each sex, most of them have a non-scientific background. But still, we have this triple interaction. And again, we observe this pattern only in math, not in literacy, and only in first grade, not in preschool. And again, this is an effect that explains only a tiny fraction of the sex difference in math here, about 4%. So yes, we have some evidence that teachers play a role too, in the sense that male teachers with a scientific background may be the most at risk of increasing gender gaps. But this is like a distal factors, and here the proximal factors, the things that teachers do in the classroom that might have produced those effects, they were just out of reach from the study, but it can be kind of inferred from the other studies that showed the effects of implicit and explicit gender stereotypes. And also other studies that observed teachers' practices in the classroom. Okay, I think I'm going to skip this study because here the outcome is not sex differences in math, but sex differences in language and literacy. We'll come back to that in the discussion if you want to see the results. But the last thing that I want to show is our intervention study. So can I jump? Yes, I can jump. Okay. So the last part of Lila's PhD was to try and do something about this gender gap in mathematics. And so we thought, okay, there is evidence that that teachers play a role. Obviously, it's not entirely their fault. Maybe it's nobody's fault, but teachers play a role. So not only not only they may carry part of this socialization effect that induces the gender gap, but on top of that, even if they don't, they're in a very good position to intervene because they see all the pupils for 6 hours per day or throughout the year. And so even if the gender stereotypes or if the gender gap is induced by something else, they might be able to counteract it, if only they were well trained for that. So that was the idea, to target teachers at the start of primary school, because we know that they have an impact, and if we can train in the right manner all teachers in France, then we can have an effect on all pupils in France. And we try to organize the training in such a way that it would be scalable if it worked. And so the way we operated was to collaborate with 3 academic regions in France, and to propose to offer a specific gender-sensitive training in order to reduce this gender gap in mathematics in first grade, but as part of an experiment, because we wanted to know if this training would work, and therefore we needed a control group. So we set up a randomized control trial. And so this was organized to fit within the compulsory training curriculum of primary school teachers. They have to have 6 hours of training per year on math teaching and 6 hours of training per year on French literacy teaching and 6 hours on something else. And so basically we agreed with those regions that we would fit into those 6 hours of compulsory training. And so we designed the study with 3 groups. The first one with our target gender-sensitive training. Our second one with a training which was more targeted on just teaching maths well, because anyway, there's a big issue with maths teaching in France to begin with. And some collaborators thought that maybe if you simply improve the quality of math teaching, you're also going to decrease the gender gap. So that was a hypothesis worth testing. And then a real control group, which just received math training as usual from the available catalog of their academic region. And of course, the teachers were randomized into the 3 groups. And so our hypothesis was that the teachers in the gender-sensitive training would be the ones who would have the smallest gender gap. They would kind of close the gap to some extent. And perhaps that those with the math didactic training might also close the gap to some extent. And finally, that those with the math didactic training might be able to raise math performance overall, because that was the point of this training. Okay, just to give you some details about the gender-sensitive training. So basically, we tried to gather all the information that was available in the scientific literature about the effect of gender stereotypes, stereotype threats, differences between boys and girls in terms of anxiety, in terms of performance under speeded instructions, under exam conditions, and so on. So everything that was known that could be conveyed to teachers, first to make them realize of the biases that they might convey and the differential treatment that they might do with boys and girls, and also some practical recommendations to modify their practices. And the 6-hour training was spread over 7 sessions over Zoom, because there were 700 teachers and they were scattered over 3 different regions, so we could not be there with all of them. And yeah, we covered those different topics. Okay, and this is this is a screenshot from our Zoom sessions. This is a screenshot from one of the quizzes that they had to do after the Zoom session. And this is an example of some kind of summary recaps that we provided them with, that they could print out and have on their desk to remind them of what they should or should not do in their classroom. And the other training group, well, for the math didactic training, we had the participation of a very experienced math consultant who does this training all the time and who delivered her training in exactly the same format as our gender sensitive training. Oh, sorry, this is wrong. So, okay, this should be on the right. Yeah, okay, so sorry, these 2 correspond to the math didactic training, and those 2 are the control group. So the control group, they just picked another math training in the catalog of their region, and we had no knowledge of what kind of training they received. It was kind of heterogeneous across all the participants. Okay. Okay, and this was spread over an entire school year. With in September, the pupils took the national evaluation, so we knew their initial level in mathematics and in literacy. And then we had the 7th training sessions over the school year. There was a first stage of national evaluations in the middle of 1st grade, and then at the end of 2nd grade, which provided the endpoints for the evaluation of impact. And to cut a long story short, this is the gender gap in maths. on the y-axis. 0 is no gender gap, and as you can see, there was no gender gap at the beginning of first grade, and it emerged at the middle of first grade, and it increased at the beginning of second grade, just as is observed in all the national evaluations and in the ELF cohort. And the 3 lines are the 3 training groups, and as you can see, there's just no difference whatsoever between the 3 training groups. So in a nutshell, we entirely failed to change the practices of the teachers in such a way that this would change the gender gap in mathematics. So to conclude, our gender-sensitive training did not reduce gender differences in maths. The math didactic training did not work either, by the way. Of course, our training was far from perfect. It was quite light, just 6 hours. But basically, this is the same as they receive in terms of math training time per year. Actually, French teachers are notoriously little trained compared to our other European teachers. And of course, this was all done through Zoom, so this is not the way you want to organize effective professional development. Of course, ideally, we would have been there with the teachers. We would have done practical training. We would have done supervision, etc., etc. But it was just completely infeasible at such a scale. And if it had been feasible, and if we had done it, and if it had worked, it would have been impossible to scale it up. So that's why we kept it this way as well. So I think, yeah, there may be no easy fix. Maybe the gap can be prevented or can be reduced by intervening on teacher training. But if it can, then this probably involves much more intensive and practical teacher training in order to have any effect on their practices. So to wrap it up, we've seen that gender differences in language and literacy appear as early as 2 years old, and in mathematics, they appear later during first grade. Differences, I didn't show this. Differences in maths are partly explained by the gendered family organization, also by teachers' influence, but surprisingly not by gendered activities. And of course, with all those factors taken together, we are far from fully explaining the math gender gap. We also studied the effect of behavioral differences between boys and girls, and we found that the fact that boys have higher externalizing symptoms plays against their performance in school, so that it increases their lag in language and literacy, but it decreases also their advantage in math. And finally, we saw that light touch teacher training is not sufficient to decrease the gender gap in math in first grade, sadly. That's it. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Franck. What a lovely and insightful talk. That was really interesting. Thank you. There are already some questions in the chat, but while people just have a few questions, I'll just ask a general one if that's okay. For all the educators here, what would be the most important take-home message from what you've done from your trainings? What can they do?
For educators, I think I would repeat it. I would simply repeat whatever we put in our gender-sensitive training. I mean, there have been some observations of the fact, for example, that teachers, or at least some teachers, tend to treat boys and girls differently. So, like for example, in mathematics, they will tend to ask difficult math questions to boys and easier questions to girls, or they will tend to question boys in maths and girls in French, for example. So obviously, I'm going, even though our training did not work, I'm still going to advise the same things, that they should first, of course, refrain from any explicit gender stereotyping, but be aware also of potential implicit biases, and basically watch yourself, watch the way you treat boys and girls. You can count on a paper sheet on your desk the number of boys and girls that you question in math and in literacy and in other disciplines, just as a sanity check to see if there is any imbalance, and well, this sort of practical advice. And maybe for some of them, this will have an effect.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. That's really useful. I'm just looking through the chat. Maria had a first question on clarifying. I think this was the first study you presented, that lone parent families were excluded from this analysis, which I think was the case when you were looking at gendered
Lone,
family.
yes, in the analysis of the gendered family organization, yes, we only took families with two parents, I mean, two opposite sex parents, obviously.
Okay. Um, and Astrid is asking, do you have thoughts on why effects were observed only in the first grade students?
So it seems that everybody's spontaneous interpretation is to say that this is because something occurs in school, and therefore this must be teachers doing something. And I think yes, there is evidence that teachers are playing a role. Uh, However, some people have been using the fact that it appears in first grade and it's not present before first grade to kind of discount the hypothesis that this could be due to earlier factors, including very early biological factors. I think that you cannot discard such hypotheses on that basis. The, so just for the sake of the argument, there could be also very early biological effects that set boys and girls onto slightly different cognitive paths, but perhaps those cognitive differences cannot be revealed until the cognitive tasks that they are given reach a certain level, certain cognitive demands that will allow those differences to be expressed. So the fact that they appear in first grade, maybe it could be that it's just because first grade is the beginning of formal math training. In kindergarten, they do like counting, they do drawing that resembles geometry, but it's not real geometry, and so they prepare kids to learn mathematics, but formal training, formal teaching of math occurs in first grade, and maybe that's this formal teaching that acts as the revelator of underlying differences. It could be. I don't have the answer.
Okay, that's interesting. I think this links a bit to Catherine's question. She says, very provocative question. Would you have definite arguments from your data that there is no genetic difference, innate differences between boys and girls' math skills?
No, I think these data can absolutely not address any biological hypotheses. Other kinds of studies might, and well, I could give an equally long lecture on potential biological factors, but that's a different story. I think the evidence for biological, I mean, I think the hypothesis that there might be some biological factors involved cannot be easily dismissed, as some do. I think it must be taken seriously, although it is very difficult to prove. But again, as the social hypothesis is also difficult to prove. So yeah, I don't have a final conclusion to this story.
Mm, that's nice. I think Melanie's question was also about the effects found specifically in this grade and not earlier. And I think she was just showing the French system, like the phrasing. Melanie, are you okay with this question?
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
just
Yeah, it's
amazing.
worth saying that when I say preschool or kindergarten, basically in France, it's already compulsory education because compulsory schooling starts at age 4. So basically, everything that I showed was part of compulsory schooling, and we have 100% of the kids into those grades.
Thank you. Roxana asks, she says, evidence suggests that girls are more likely to have high sensitivity, sensory processing sensitivity. So those with this being more impacted by their environment, I was wondering if it was possible that this is what is playing a role in math learning. So those with sensory processing sensitivity are more likely to be impacted by teacher biases.
I'm not sure I know what she's referring to as higher sensitivity, sensory processing sensitivity. I'm not sure I know what this refers to exactly.
I think in general, it's when you're sensitive to your environment and things around you. So it
Mhm.
can be any sense, senses, and some people have it more than others.
Okay, possibly. It's not clear to me why this might be associated with math rather than any other topic. Um, I have to say, I think it's difficult. I mean, some people have a very clear story about the relation between certain cognitive skills and maths ability. So one story is that spatial skills are key to maths ability, and boys' advantage in spatial skills explains their advantage in maths ability. This may play a role because there is good evidence that there's a boy advantage in spatial skills that starts very early on, long before first grade. However, I think it's only part of the story because maths is a very complex cultural creation that involves basically every possible cognitive function. Of course, spatial ability is involved in math, but verbal ability is also extremely strongly involved in math and working memory and processing speed. And I think you can take any cognitive ability, you name it, and it is involved in some aspect of math ability. And among all those cognitive functions, some show a boy's advantage, some show a girl's advantage. And so in the end, it's not very clear to me why, on the basis of those small cognitive differences that can be observed between boys and girls, it's not clear to me why you would predict at the outset a boy advantage in math rather than the other way around or rather than just equality.
Thank you. Sorry,
Thank
is
you.
it okay if I quickly clarify what I meant by my question? But yeah, thank you so much for your response. I think I was just kind of getting at like within girls who are being influenced by a teacher that might be biased towards their maths ability,
Ah,
like within those girls, like maybe some girls would be influenced more that by that because of their sensitivity, whereas others might not be affected. And I was wondering if there would be like differences within the gender. That makes sense.
oh, yeah, I see what you mean. That's an interesting hypothesis. Unfortunately, we had really no way to assess this. But yes, if we had some instrument to assess this notion of sensitivity, then we might be able to test whether it moderates the gender gap, which would be very interesting, of course.
Thank you very much.
We had a few questions asking about the variations between the OECD countries. So Irene is asking if the family organization would explain the sex differences. And then later, Gabrielle, I think, is also asking if you could speculate on why there would be those differences between countries in the PISA results.
Okay, so about the OCD, I mean,
And Davil's.
the international comparisons, I think it's quite interesting. So I'm going to show two different graphs. So uh, So this is the one I initially showed. And so when you look at the countries where there seems to be no gender gap, Finland, Slovenia, Norway, Slovakia, Sweden, Iceland, South Korea, you're thinking, oh yes, of course, these are very advanced countries. They must be more gender equal, and that's why the gender gap in math is much smaller. So it's all due to gender equality in the country. Well, that's the picture only for the OECD country, but when you look at the more complete picture, which you can also find in the PISA reports, which include not only OECD countries, but all countries that participate in the PISA assessments. So here now the graph is turned vertical and split in two columns. So these are the countries here with the largest gender gap in maths, and these are the countries with the smallest ones, and those even have it reversed. So now you look at the bottom of the chart with those that have kind of no gender gap or even a gender gap in favor of girls. And yes, sure, you still find Iceland and Sweden and Norway, but you find all sorts of other countries which do not really fit your idea of gender equality. Um, and so the picture is much more complex than this. And actually, this is a well-known phenomenon called the gender equality paradox, which actually suggests that the gender gap in maths may be largest in countries that are more gender equal, which would be a paradox. Of course, this phenomenon is a bit controversial, and there are several interpretations for that, but I'm not going to get into that. This is just to say that if you just look at international comparisons of this gender gap in mathematics, the evidence does not support a simple interpretation in terms of greater gender equality decreases this gender gap in math.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. So I think we've just gone past 5. So thank you everyone for all your questions, and thank you for participating. Thank you so much, Frank, for taking the time to speak to us. It was really a fabulous talk. You're getting lots of cheers from everyone.
Thank you everyone for all the questions.
But thank you so much.
Bye-bye.